Lower the launch. I'm done letting that nobody destroy my future.
Excellent. Once he disappears over the horizon, everything aboard becomes ours.
My wife looked me in the eye, rested one hand on Adrian Cross's arm, and told the crew to put me off the yacht before I embarrassed her again. Behind her, the gold letters spelling Astrea gleamed above a vessel worth nearly $900 million, and not one person on that deck seemed to know the security system had already recognized me. Claire stood beneath the aft deck lights in a white dress I had never seen before, surrounded by investors, charter brokers, and people whose smiles vanished when they noticed my oil-stained work shirt. Adrian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This is a private departure," he said, with the patience wealthy men use when they want humiliation to look procedural. Claire folded her arms. "You shouldn't have come. Evan, I told you this weekend mattered." I had come because her text said she was attending a client event at the marina, but her wedding ring was missing, and Adrian's hand rested at the small of her back like it belonged there. What stopped me from speaking was not shock. It was the restricted access panel beside the salon doors. Adrian had keyed it open without hesitation. That corridor did not appear on commercial deck plans. Only Vale Meridian executives, shipyard engineers, and the trust's security staff were supposed to know it existed. "I'm your husband," I said, keeping my voice level because 20 people were watching Claire decide what I was worth. She glanced toward Adrian before answering. That small movement hurt more than the words that followed. "You're a marine instructor who followed me onto a chartered vessel after I asked for space." A few guests shifted, but nobody challenged her. Adrian stepped closer and lowered his voice as if offering mercy. He said the crew would return me to shore in one of Astrea's service launches. And if I cooperated, no police report would be necessary. I almost laughed at the phrase chartered vessel. The yacht was owned by the Vale Continuity Trust, and the authorization to move it required signatures Adrian could not legally possess. Yet revealing that truth on a crowded deck would have warned whoever helped him that the quiet teacher they dismissed was Lillian Vale's son. 2 crewmen approached. I recognized neither of them. Astrea's regular captain, Sofia Alvarez, would never have permitted an unauthorized departure. "Where is Captain Alvarez?" I asked. Adrian's expression tightened for less than a second. Claire saw only resistance. "Stop turning everything into a technical problem," she snapped. "For once, accept that you are not the most important person in the room." Then she told the crew to take my phone. They lowered me into a 12-foot service launch while Astrea was still inside the marked channel, close enough to shore that the danger could be disguised as inconvenience. Claire watched from the rail. I searched her face for doubt. For the woman who had once held a flashlight while I repaired a flooded generator during a hurricane. What I saw instead was determination hardened by an audience. A crewman tossed my phone into the launch after removing the battery, then released the line. The engine started on the first turn. For several minutes, I followed Astrea's wake toward open water, expecting the autopilot to return me to the marina. Then the engine died. The navigation screen went black. The fuel gauge dropped to 0, and the yacht continued south without slowing. I pulled the engine cover and smelled no gasoline. The tank was full. The cutoff relay had been triggered electronically from a remote command station. Someone had not merely removed me. Someone had disabled the boat after putting distance between us. By then, the current had begun carrying me away from the shipping channel. Fear came hard. But training reduced it to tasks: stabilize the hull, restore power, transmit location, preserve evidence. Behind the console, I found a sealed diagnostic port. When I touched the sensor, a pale blue light appeared. Principal credential verified flashed for 3 seconds before the display went dark. That hidden confirmation changed the problem. Astrea's old security architecture had been designed after a kidnapping threat against my mother. A principal in distress signal could travel independently of the yacht's visible network, but only if the backup satellite module remained active. I opened the console with a corroded wrench and rerouted power from the bilge alarm. The launch rocked hard enough to drive my shoulder into the hull. Salt water soaked my knees. I kept working because anger was useless until I was alive. After 9 attempts, the diagnostic port pulsed twice. Somewhere, the system had sent my biometric identity, location, and vessel status to the trust's emergency contacts. I restored limited fuel flow by manually opening the cutoff valve. But the engine ran only in short bursts. For nearly an hour, I moved between drifting and steering toward the distant coast. When a rescue beacon finally appeared, I expected the Coast Guard. Instead, a black response craft approached carrying Captain Sofia Alvarez and Mara Bennett. Sofia hauled me aboard. Mara wrapped a thermal blanket around my shoulders, then held up a secure tablet. My name filled the screen, Even Mercer Vale. Controlling beneficiary principal in distress. Your mother's in intensive care, she said. Estrella was moved on a forged authorization, and someone inside Vale Meridian helped them do it. I looked back at the darkness where my wife had vanished with another man. For the first time that night, Betrayal felt smaller than the trap surrounding it. By sunrise, Mara had me in a private room at Broward General with an IV in my arm, a Coast Guard investigator outside the door, and 3 unanswered calls from Claire lighting the replacement phone she had given me. I did not return them. Instead, I stared at the bandage across my palm and thought about the life Claire believed she had married into. I taught marine propulsion and electrical diagnostics at Broward Maritime Technical College, where half my students arrived convinced that one failed semester had already decided their future. I liked showing them that a diesel engine did not care about pedigree. It responded to patience, evidence, and the willingness to find the fault nobody else had noticed. On weekends, I volunteered with a coastal rescue unit and repaired boats for families who could not afford commercial rates. Claire had once loved that about me. We met after a hurricane tore roofs from neighborhoods north of Miami. She organized food, beds, and frightened children while I kept the shelter generators alive. She brought me cold coffee and said I was the first man she had met who could fix a machine without making sure everyone knew it. That sentence felt like a promise. Contempt arrived slowly enough that I could mistake it for fatigue. Claire took a position with an international hospitality group, and her work moved from conference rooms to private clubs, yacht launches, and donor dinners. Her older sister, Vanessa, began asking when I planned to turn my boat school job into a real career. Claire defended me at first. Then she stopped correcting her. Later, she began editing me before events. Different shoes. Fewer stories about students. No mention of volunteer rescues unless someone important brought up philanthropy first. The first time she called my work small. She apologized. The next time, she explained that she only wanted me to use my potential. Eventually, apology and explanation disappeared. I responded by becoming quieter. When she asked why I sometimes received calls from Boston lawyers or disappeared from meetings near Port Everglades, I said they concerned old family matters, when tuition bills, medical expenses, or the down payment on our townhouse somehow became manageable. I let her believe careful saving had done it. I told myself I was protecting our marriage from money. In truth, I was protecting myself from the answer to a question I never had the courage to ask. Would Claire still choose me if she knew what my name could buy? My mother, Lillian Vale, had built Vale Meridian from a 2-person marine electronics lab into a company whose systems guided cargo ships, rescue craft, and naval support vessels worldwide. She believed wealth was useful only when tied to control, and control was safe only when placed in structures no outsider could easily reach. After my sister, Rachel, died during a rushed autonomous rescue trial, I stopped admiring that philosophy. The formal investigation blamed a chain of engineering and operational failures, but I had seen the internal warnings Rachel sent before the demonstration. My mother had not ordered anyone to ignore them. Yet she had created a culture where delaying a milestone felt like disloyalty. I left the executive program, used my father's surname, and refused a permanent office, board seat, or public role. Lillian accepted the arrangement because threats against our family were real and because she thought distance would eventually cure my anger. It never did. She secured my inheritance through the Vale Continuity Trust, while I built a life that seemed separate from hers. Claire knew my mother was wealthy and estranged. She did not know the scale, the voting rights, or that every ordinary year of our marriage unfolded beside a locked door I alone could open. That secrecy was my failure. Even before Claire made hers, I did not simply withhold a bank balance. I denied her the chance to decide whether she could live with the history, scrutiny, and obligations attached to my family. Worse, I watched her changing and treated her behavior like evidence in a private trial. Each cruel remark became another reason not to trust her, while every unexplained call from Mara became another reason for Claire not to trust me. Tessa Lang arrived with a preliminary report pulled from Claire's shared calendar backups and Vale Meridian's visitor logs. Adrian had told Claire they first met by chance at a hotel development reception 7 months earlier. The record showed he had requested the guest list in advance, asked specifically whether Claire would attend, and booked a meeting suite under a powerless subsidiary 2 floors above the event. 3 weeks before that, someone using the same subsidiary had purchased a background report on me, including my teaching schedule, volunteer assignments, marriage records, and connection to Lillian Vale. I read the dates twice before handing the tablet back. Adrian had not entered our marriage because Claire happened to interest him. He had selected the door first, then studied exactly how to convince her to open it. Tessa built the timeline across 3 monitors in a secure conference room beneath Vale Meridian's Port Everglades office. I watched Adrian's influence appear not as one dramatic move, but as a sequence of deliberate advantages. 2 months before he met Claire, a Pelorus consultant had subscribed to her company's private industry calendar. A week later, Claire received an invitation to moderate a luxury development panel, even though she had never worked on a project of that size. The sponsor was Northline Civic Ventures, a shell company Mara traced back to Pelorus through Delaware filings. After the event, Adrian introduced her to hotel owners, praised her ability to translate access into value, and recommended her for consulting work that nearly doubled her income. None of that erased Claire's choices. She accepted the attention, hid the meetings, and lied to me. But the records showed Adrian had manufactured an environment in which every compliment answered one of her grievances. He knew she felt underestimated, resented my refusal to pursue wealth, and knew which evenings I taught late classes. He didn't discover a weakness, Tessa said. He purchased the data needed to locate it. Looking at Claire's smiling event photographs, I understood Adrian had not wandered into our marriage. He had conducted due diligence on it. The reason became clear when Mara opened a valuation report Adrian's firm had prepared but never filed. Vale Meridian's Autonomous Navigation Division was weeks from final certification for an international port security contract. If approved, its encrypted routing systems would become embedded in cargo terminals across 4 continents. Adrian's report recommended forcing a sale before certification increased the division's value and before the Vale Continuity Trust transferred voting control to me. Pelorus could not buy it directly because the trust's succession clause blocked any outside sale during the first year after Lillian's death. Adrian needed delay, confusion, and an argument that I had concealed assets from my spouse. Claire gave him a believable story. She could claim I built our marriage on fraud, hid property relevant to divorce proceedings, and manipulated family wealth beyond her knowledge. Mara tapped the page. A temporary court order would not give him the company. She said, "It could keep you from voting while his board allies declare an emergency." The plural mattered. We suspected Russell Dane, but the report referred to an internal transition committee that did not officially exist. Adrian was planning with someone who understood Vale Meridian's bylaws, contract deadlines, and the narrow window between Lillian's death and my certification as beneficiary. The evidence surrounding Estrella made that internal connection harder to dismiss. The charter authorization carried Lillian's digital signature, yet hospital records showed she had been unconscious for 14 hours before the file was created. Tessa preserved the server image rather than opening the document on Vale Meridian's network, because whoever altered it might still have access. The yacht's camera archive had also lost 11 minutes. beginning seconds before the crew took my phone and ending after the service launch was released. The deletion came through an administrator account assigned to Russell's office. But Mara warned that an account was not a person. We needed the device, location, and authentication trail. Then Sophia placed the launch's propulsion module on the table inside an evidence bag. Its black box memory showed the fuel cutoff command had originated from Astrea's bridge network. The manufacturer was verifying the code sequence. But my reading was unmistakable. It was not a malfunction. Someone aboard had disabled the launch after I was set adrift. I asked whether Claire could have known. Sophia shook her head. The command required bridge credentials. That did not absolve Claire of ordering me removed. But it separated her betrayal from Adrian's larger plan. He had been willing to let the ocean erase a problem his legal strategy had not anticipated. My replacement phone rang before we reviewed the payment records. Claire's name appeared. And for the first time since the rescue, I answered. She said Adrian believed I had sabotaged the launch to create leverage against them. I asked why he knew the launch had been disabled before investigators released that fact. Silence followed. Then she accused me of twisting everything because I could not accept that she had left. I wanted to tell her Adrian had studied her, financed her opportunities, and built a corporate case around her anger. Mara slid a note across the table. Do not disclose the audit. So I asked one question. Did Adrian ever explain how he knew my mother's yacht had a restricted corridor? She ended the call. Seconds later, Mara's secure line rang. She listened without speaking, then lowered the phone. My mother had died at 10:42 that morning from complications following her stroke. Grief came mixed with anger, unfinished arguments, and the memory of every call I had refused. Mara gave me less than a minute before placing a sealed envelope in front of me. The succession hearing begins at 9 tomorrow at Vale Meridian headquarters. She said, the board, the trust officers, and your wife's attorneys have been notified. I touched my mother's embossed signature. By morning, the name I had buried would no longer belong only to me. Vale Meridian's boardroom overlooked the port where container ships moved through the haze, each guided by systems my mother's company had helped design. I entered through a private security corridor with Mara beside me. But when the doors opened, every face turned as if I were the intrusion. Malcolm Price sat at the head of the table. Russell Dane occupied the seat to his right. Claire stood behind her attorneys near the windows, wearing the controlled expression she used at donor dinners when something had gone wrong. Adrian was absent, though two lawyers from a firm representing Pelorus sat behind her. Mara began with the trust instrument. Not with my name. The Vale Continuity Trust held 51% of Vale Meridian's voting shares, owned Astrea, and possessed the right to nominate 4 of 9 directors. Upon Lillian's death, those powers transferred to her certified adult beneficiary. Mara placed my birth certificate, amended trust schedule, and biometric succession record before the independent directors. That beneficiary is Evan Mercervale, she said. Nobody applauded. Malcolm removed his glasses. Russell stared at me as if recognition were an accusation. Claire's mouth opened, then closed. I had imagined this truth surfacing many times. I had never imagined it would look less like a coronation than an evidence hearing. Russell spoke first. He did not deny the documents. He questioned whether a man who had avoided the company for 15 years should control it overnight. Malcolm's concern was harder to dismiss. Vale Meridian handled port security, federal contracts, and safety systems that could not be governed by family symbolism. He asked what operating authority I expected to exercise. I answered with the only honest position available. I understood engines, failure analysis, training, and emergency systems. But I had never run an 8,000-person corporation. I would exercise the voting rights legally assigned to me, retain experienced executives, and submit major decisions to independent review during the transition. That answer steadied some directors and disappointed others who expected either arrogance or surrender. Then Claire crossed the room and placed both hands on the table. You let me believe we were building a life from nothing, she said. You watched me worry about mortgages, promotion, and whether we could afford children while you controlled all of this. Her words were not entirely accurate, but the wound beneath them was real. I told her I had not controlled the trust while my mother lived and had refused most distributions. Still, I had hidden the scale of my family, the risks, and the future obligations attached to my name. I denied you information you had a right to know. I said, that was wrong. It does not make what happened on Estrella right. For one moment, Claire's anger faltered. Then one of her attorneys slid a petition across the table. She was seeking temporary restraints on any transfer, pledge, or restructuring of assets she claimed might be marital property. Mara replied that the trust predated our marriage, that our prenuptial agreement excluded inherited voting shares, and that Estrella belonged to the trust rather than to me. Claire's lawyer did not argue ownership. He argued concealment, coercion, and possible dissipation. The distinction mattered because a judge could freeze certain actions long enough to create the delay Adrian needed. Malcolm called a recess, and Claire followed me into the hallway. She said she had spent years feeling that I was measuring her against a standard I refused to explain. I admitted I had been. She asked whether I ever planned to tell her. I said I had planned many versions and chosen silence every time. Her eyes filled, but her voice remained hard. Adrian never made me feel ashamed for wanting more. I could have told her his attention had been purchased through shell companies and background reports. Instead, I said, he made wanting more useful to him. She stepped back as if I had insulted her intelligence. Perhaps I had. Perhaps the truth had arrived too late to sound like anything but revenge. The court order came before the recess ended. It did not transfer my shares or invalidate the trust, but it temporarily prohibited me from directing a sale, removing directors, accessing certain marital financial records, or exercising extraordinary control until an emergency hearing. At the same time, every phone in the boardroom began vibrating. A financial news outlet had published leaked excerpts from the petition under the headline, "Secret Here Hid Fortune from Wife While Seeking Control of Defense Contractor." The article included a photograph of me leaving the hospital and an altered memorandum suggesting Lillian had considered appointing Powerless as Vale Meridian's restructuring advisor. Russell demanded an immediate special committee to review my fitness. Malcolm approved it over Mara's objection, arguing that lenders and federal partners required visible independence. Then Tessa sent me a secure message. Someone had accessed the succession archive during the hearing and copied the original trust exhibits using Russell's administrator credentials. Before I could show Mara, a second alert appeared. Polaris had filed notice of an emergency acquisition proposal for the Autonomous Navigation Division. I looked through the glass wall at Claire, speaking with Adrian's lawyers, and understood the inheritance had been revealed exactly when he wanted it. Revealed not to give me power, but to make the world afraid of what I might do with it. By noon, Vale Meridian's crisis had escaped the boardroom. 2 port authorities suspended contract renewals pending clarification of my authority. A federal procurement office requested an ethics review. And television crews gathered outside headquarters beneath banners, calling me the hidden heir. The special committee restricted my access to operational systems. And Malcolm appointed an interim executive panel to approve every decision carrying financial or security consequences. I could still vote on ordinary matters, but any attempt to remove Russell, block the Pelleris proposal, or direct the investigation would be portrayed as interference. Employees watched me in elevators with the guarded expressions people reserve for a new owner rumored to be planning layoffs. Claire gave a statement outside the courthouse saying she had discovered that her marriage was built on concealment. She did not mention the service launch, the disabled fuel system, or Adrian's role in moving Estrella. The statement was not entirely false, which made it more effective. By evening, Pelleris released its acquisition offer, promising to preserve jobs, protect contracts, and place the autonomous division under stable professional stewardship. Adrian had transformed theft into rescue. I sat alone in my mother's office, surrounded by models of vessels she had designed, and wondered whether surrendering my voting authority was the only way to stop the company from bleeding. Mara rejected the idea before I finished explaining it. She said stepping aside would not end the attack. It would remove the only block between Adrian and a forced sale. I argued that my presence had become the crisis. She answered that my secrecy had created vulnerability. Not the shell companies, forged authorization, or attempted acquisition. Responsibility is not the same as guilt. She said, do not confuse them because guilt feels simpler. Tessa arrived with the first complete forensic map. The deleted yacht footage had been erased from a tablet registered to Russell's office. But the device had connected through Estrella's guest network while Adrian was aboard. The propulsion manufacturer had also authenticated the remote cutoff command that disabled my launch. Those facts were powerful, but not yet enough to prove who issued the command or whether Russell knowingly supplied access. Sophia had recovered a secondary telemetry archive from Estrella's rescue drone system, although decrypting it required approval from the independent committee. Malcolm granted that approval but refused to delay the powerless vote beyond 48 hours. His decision angered me until I understood it. He did not trust Adrian, yet he could not ask lenders and employees to survive indefinitely on my belief that evidence would arrive. For the first time, I saw the board's doubt, not as betrayal, but as a responsibility they owed to everyone whose livelihood depended on us. Near midnight, Mara gave me a small recorder found in Lillian's private trust file. My mother's voice sounded weaker than I remembered. She did not reveal Adrian's scheme or leave a perfect solution. She admitted something harder. After Rachel died, she had used legal structures, surveillance, and secrecy to prevent another loss she could not control. She said she had protected my inheritance while failing to protect our relationship. Power makes frightened people believe they can remove uncertainty. She said, they cannot. They can only decide who pays for it. She instructed the trustees to give me every lawful tool available, but warned that if I used those tools to punish everyone who had wounded me, Vale Meridian would inherit my anger instead of her mistakes. I listened twice. Then I opened the folder Tessa had prepared containing Claire's private messages with Adrian. Some were humiliating. Others exposed fears she had never trusted me enough to say aloud. Releasing them would have shifted public sympathy within hours. But most had nothing to do with fraud or corporate misconduct. I marked only the exchanges involving Estrella, the shell companies, and Adrian's requests for internal information. The rest I sealed from the board presentation. Tessa asked whether I was sure. I told her revenge would win the news cycle and lose the reason I was fighting. At Dan, I sent Malcolm a written proposal. I would testify under oath about my concealed identity, disclose every trust distribution made during the marriage, and accept an independent operating chief for 1 year. In return, the board would delay the powerless vote until the emergency hearing, preserve all systems, and allow regulators to observe the evidence review. I also asked Mara to notify law enforcement about the verified launch sabotage. Without attaching Claire's unrelated personal communications, Malcolm agreed by a 5-4 vote. Russell opposed it and demanded that Polaris be allowed to present its rescue plan during the same hearing. I welcomed the request. Adrian had built his strategy on the assumption that I would either hide behind my inheritance or lash out at everyone who humiliated me. I intended to do neither. Before leaving for the boardroom, I returned to the classroom where my morning students were waiting beside a dismantled propulsion unit. I explained that I had to miss the lesson because a larger system had failed in ways no manual could solve. One student asked how I knew where to start. I pointed to the diagnostic board and said, with the first fact nobody can argue with. 2 hours later, I walked into the emergency hearing carrying the verified timestamp from my mother's forged authorization. The emergency hearing began with every weakness I had spent years hiding projected on a 40-foot screen. Vale Meridian's directors sat on one side of the chamber, regulators and lenders on the other, while cameras carried the proceedings to employees gathered in offices around the world. Adrian Cross occupied the witness table beside Russell Dane and the attorneys representing Polaris. Claire sat behind them, separate from me and close enough to hear every word. Before Mara presented a single exhibit, I asked Malcolm for the floor. I told the board that I had hidden my legal identity from my wife, avoided the obligations attached to my family, and treated silence as proof of character. I admitted that Claire had entered a marriage without knowing the risks. Scrutiny and future authority connected to my name. Those choices damaged my marriage and this company, I said. But my failures do not authenticate a forged signature. Erase 11 minutes of security footage. Or authorize anyone to disable a rescue launch. The room remained still. Adrian smiled as though my confession had confirmed his argument. His lawyer introduced the charter authorization bearing Lillian's digital signature and claimed it proved she had approved Pelorus's access to Estrella before her stroke. Then I placed the verified server timestamp beside the hospital's neurological log. The document had been created at 2:18 a.m. 47 minutes after two physicians certified that my mother was unconscious and incapable of electronic authorization. Adrian's lawyer called the discrepancy a clerical error. Russell said Vale Meridian servers often process signatures late when vessels operated offshore. I asked Tessa to display the satellite synchronization record. Estrella's protected systems did not queue executive authorizations. They registered them against 3 independent clocks, including one maintained by a federal navigation network. The signature file had not arrived late. It had been generated from inside Russell's administrative domain and then backdated. That was the first reversal, and it was small enough that Adrian initially tried to laugh it away. The second began when Mara connected the altered authorization to the other records. Payments from Northline Civic Ventures had reached Claire's consultancy, the replacement crew agency, and a non-profit controlled by Russell's brother-in-law. Tessa overlaid those transfers with the deleted camera interval. The administrator tablet used to erase the footage had connected to Estrella's guest network from the chair Adrian occupied during the voyage. Sophia then authenticated the rescue drone telemetry, which had preserved a wider view after the main cameras went dark. The footage showed Adrian handing the tablet to the temporary first officer moments before my phone was taken. The propulsion manufacturer's engineer confirmed that the same tablet sent the encrypted fuel cutoff command to my launch. Adrian stood and accused us of fabricating a technical narrative from unrelated systems. Mara replied by producing the device's hardware certificate, preserved by the Yacht's security archive the instant it issued the command. Neutral directors who had avoided looking at me now turned toward Adrian. Malcolm asked him whether Pelorus had financed Claire's consulting opportunities before meeting her. Adrian said the payments were legitimate business development and that Claire had been chosen because of her talent. Claire's face changed when Tessa displayed an internal investor memo referring to her as the spouse channel. Adrian objected that the phrase had been taken out of context. I did not know what Claire was thinking, but I saw her grip the back of the chair until her knuckles whitened. Mara then played the final evidence, a compliance archive recovered from Pelorus's European data room after a lender preserved records under regulatory notice. Adrian's voice discussed delaying Vale's succession through the spouse narrative, replacing Claire with a more credible claimant if public sympathy weakened, and forcing the company into a distressed sale before certification. Another speaker asked whether Claire expected a permanent role. Adrian answered that she expected many things and would become a liability once the trust was frozen. The recording only made sense because the earlier clues had established the shell companies, the false charter, the administrator device, and the sabotaged launch. Without that chain, it could have been dismissed as posturing. With it, the third reversal was complete. Claire rose slowly and asked Adrian whether he had ever intended to build a life with her. He did not answer her. He told his lawyers to terminate the hearing and activate the emergency acquisition clause. Russell moved that Vale Meridian accept the Pelorus offer before regulators could suspend additional contracts. Adrian's team delivered notices claiming that 3 lenders had already declared defaults, but Malcolm refused to recognize them until the institutions confirmed independently. 2 lenders immediately denied issuing the notices. A third reported that its letterhead had been copied from an earlier agreement. Adrian's contingency plan was collapsing. Yet he continued speaking in the calm language that had carried him into our marriage and company. He warned the board that rejecting Pelorus would destroy thousands of jobs and expose classified systems to an untested heir. I answered that the company did not need blind faith in me. It needed governance strong enough to survive me. I formally requested an independent operating chief, quarterly compliance audits, employee representation on the safety committee, and a temporary prohibition on any division sale until regulators completed their review. I also agreed that my own trust transactions and decisions would remain subject to examination. Then I voted my shares against the acquisition. Malcolm and 3 neutral directors joined me. Russell's motion failed. Federal agents entered after the vote with warrants covering data theft, securities manipulation, and conspiracy. I gave them the launch records, financial transfers, and relevant communications, the private messages that exposed Claire's fears, insults, and affair remained sealed because humiliation was not evidence. When Adrian passed me, he said I had won only because of the name I inherited. I told him the name had opened the hearing, his records had ended it. Claire found me outside the chamber after Adrian and Russell were escorted away for questioning. She looked smaller without the cameras around her, but I did not mistake shock for innocence. She said she had not known about the sabotage or the acquisition plan. I believed she might be telling the truth about those parts because the evidence supported it. She had still ordered me removed, lied about our marriage, and chosen contempt long before Adrian revealed his purpose. I was a tool. She said. You were, I answered, and you also made choices. She nodded without asking me to take her back. For once, neither of us tried to turn pain into an argument we could win. Mara joined me at the windows as employees began receiving notice that the Pelorus sale had been rejected and no layoffs were planned. The board suspended Russell, preserved all systems for regulators, and appointed Sophia to oversee vessel security. I retained voting control, but my first official resolution limited how quickly I could use it. Through the glass, Estrella rested at the pier under legal hold. The same gangway where Claire had treated me like an intruder now guarded as evidence. I had spent years believing power meant the ability to keep my identity hidden. That morning, I learned it meant accepting scrutiny, protecting people who might never trust me, and refusing to become cruel simply because cruelty had finally become available. 18 months after the hearing, Vale Meridian no longer appeared in the news every morning, which was the clearest sign that we had survived. Adrian Cross was awaiting trial on charges involving data theft, securities manipulation, conspiracy, and the deliberate interference with my launch. Russell Dane had pleaded guilty to falsifying corporate records and accepting undisclosed payments. Neither outcome restored what they had damaged, but the investigations allowed our lenders, regulators, and customers to separate the company from the men who had tried to hollow it out. I remained chairman of the board, though I appointed an experienced maritime executive, Denise Holloway, as chief executive officer and gave her authority I once would have feared surrendering. The independent audits I had promised became permanent. So did an employee safety council with the power to delay any demonstration when engineers raised unresolved concerns. My mother had built Vale Meridian to endure storms, but she had never understood that silence inside an institution could be more dangerous than weather. I could not repair her mistakes by pretending mine were smaller. Every Tuesday evening, I returned to Broward Maritime Technical College and taught advanced diagnostics. The first time a student called me Mr. Chairman, I handed him a wrench and told him titles did not loosen seized bolts. Claire and I finalized our divorce without a press conference, a public settlement fight, or any attempt to rewrite what had happened. Our prenuptial agreement kept the trust outside the marital estate, while the property we had built together was divided fairly. She admitted in a sworn statement that she had ordered the crew to remove me from Estrella and had concealed her relationship with Adrian. Prosecutors did not charge her in the corporate conspiracy because the evidence showed she had not known about the sabotage, forged authorization, or acquisition plan. That legal distinction did not erase her responsibility, and neither did Adrian's manipulation. During our final meeting, she apologized without asking for reconciliation. I told her I was sorry for making secrecy the foundation of a marriage that had once deserved honesty. We signed the last papers and left through different doors. I heard later that she had returned to event work at a smaller nonprofit and was receiving counseling, but I did not follow her life through employees. investigators, or private reports. Restraint meant nothing if it ended when nobody was watching. I also stopped using my mother's silence as an excuse for my own. The people closest to me now knew my name, my history, and the obligations that came with both before they were asked to trust me. Estrella returned to service, but not as the floating monument Adrian thought he was stealing. We converted 2 decks into classrooms, simulation labs, and temporary housing for rescue crews training along the Atlantic coast. Vale Meridian funded scholarships for mechanics, navigation specialists, cybersecurity apprentices, and students from communities where a technical career had once seemed unreachable. On the morning of the first training voyage, I stood beside the same gangway where Claire had watched strangers put me off my own vessel. This time, Sophia lowered it toward a group of scholarship students carrying tool bags and trying not to stare at the yacht above them. One young man stopped at the bottom and asked whether he was using the correct entrance. I remembered the cold launch, the dead engine, and the blue light that had recognized me when nobody else did. "It is now," I said. Then I stepped aside and watched them come aboard. The gangway had once been used to decide who belonged and who could be discarded. We had turned it into an open door, and for the first time in my life, I understood that an inheritance was not something I owned. It was something I was responsible for passing forward. If this story made you question where loyalty ends and responsibility begins, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what choice you believe Evan should have made. I would also love to know where you are listening from and whether you would have forgiven Claire.